evening and welcome to this event from the AJR, which is the Association of Jewish Refugees. We are the national charity in the UK looking after Holocaust survivors and refugees. And we also, sorry, I'm multitasking here. Let me shut that down. We also work with Holocaust education and testimony, and there's lots of information about our work on our website. And if you know of anybody who could benefit from our services, please do ask them to get in touch. We are recording this event and it will be available on our YouTube channel. I believe that as our two speakers are spotlighted, then the audience shouldn't appear, but if you are in any way concerned about appearing, please turn off your camera. And I think that's it really. Everybody is on mute. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and they will come to me, and then I will ask them on your behalf towards the end of the session, and we should be finished by 7 p.m. So I'm going to hand over, I'm going to welcome Daniel Snowman, and I'm going to hand over to David Herman now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And it's my great pleasure this evening to be in conversation with Daniel Snowman. Daniel is a prolific author and was for many years a producer at the BBC. He has written and edited almost 20 books, many of them on history and the arts, including acclaimed books on the Hitler Emigrations, the Amadeus Quartet and Placido Domingo. Daniel has just published his memoir, Just Passing Through, Interactions with the World, 1938 to 2021, a delightful account of his rich and fascinating life, including encounters with American presidents, great philosophers, even the odd pope. Daniel, what kind of home did you grow up in?
I don't remember, I was too young. I was born, actually I was born, interestingly, on the 4th of November, so I'm about to have a birthday, 1938, which years later I learned was the very week of Kristallnacht. Had Orthodox Jewish parents. My mother, Bertha Ney Lazarus, her father was Diane Lazarus, who later became acting chief rabbi, lovely grandfather. He was born in Riga. My father, Arthur Snowman from the Snowman family, she was 23, he was 25. They had this little baby boy. And 4 or 5 days later, there's this huge, horrendous event throughout the German Reich, none of which I remember. But as I grew older, you asked me about the childhood, how I was brought up, the family life. During the war, and I remember the later years of it quite clearly, going to the bomb shelter with my mummy and listening to the wireless and all that, and daddy coming home on leave from time to time. They were lovely parents, kind, honorable. I had a younger brother who's still alive, who got very seriously ill as a kid. We were Orthodox Jewish, frum but not extremist. We wanted to be good British citizens. My daddy taught me, he loved opera, but he also loved cricket. And that was not just the game and Don Bradman and trying to beat the Aussies for the Ashes. It was about, keep a straight bat, young chap, and if you're out, if you touch the ball, even whether the umpire doesn't raise his finger, walk, because that's the honorable thing to do, And after all, we won the Armada, didn't we, and beat Napoleon, and my grandpa Lazarus, the Dayan, wore a kind of church type collar. And when we met the Archbishop of Canterbury, there's a photo of them at the time of the wedding of Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip in 1947. And they were shaking hands together as equals, as it were. My grandpa didn't wear a yarmulke at the time, though normally he would. So I was brought up in an Orthodox Jewish family that was very careful. We had lovely Friday night events with the candles and so on. We didn't have milk after meat and so on, but it wasn't aggressively so. And if we saw people walking through the streets who looked a bit over frum, sort of what might be scary today or something. You said, well, if they don't, why are they needing to show off about their Jewishness? So it was that kind of atmosphere, very open-minded, very sweet, had a lovely bar mitzvah trained by my grandpa, later fill-in, but it was not exclusively ideological. It was encouraging and warm. And I always felt I was one of the boys on the night of the Seder service who's one way or another encouraged to ask questions to which there were undoubtedly reasonable, kindly answers.
Did you ever experience any anti-Semitism when you were growing up?
No, not that I was aware of. I was aware that there was anti-Semitism, of course, but I grew up in an atmosphere very Jewish. This is Northwest London. This is Edgware, a fairly recently on the edge of London, you know, greenery nearby, the end of the Northern Line. And in our little street, Hillsden Avenue, and all around, not very far from Hendon, Hampstead, whatever, very Jewish, and all the friends were Jewish. And I knew that if I went into Auntie Brenda's house or Auntie Rita's house or whatever it was, I could simply run in barefoot, run over to the fridge, and they'd say, oh, you naughty boy, Daniel, in a friendly Jewishy way. On the other hand, our next door neighbor was Mrs. Every, and she was very kind and very honorable. And she, during the war, she grew some crops and had chickens and occasionally gave us some eggs, but we were never intimate. Anti-Semitism, I wasn't ever aware of, except that there had been horrible anti-Semitism with the wicked Nazi Germans, of course, which nobody shared. We had beaten them. Churchill had beaten them. And that's why I was alive and happy and was able to go to school and then go to Christ's College, Finchley, funny thing for a Jewish boy to go to, and then Jesus College, Cambridge. We all made the sort of giggly, silly jokes. But I was never, I think my whole life, actually, David, I've only really met, worked with, known people in the academic world, in broadcasting, and the various forms of civility. And whatever anti-Semitism there may have been, or caricatures of me, perhaps, among others, it never really became major. It was never really hurtful or destructive. There may have been the odd occasion when I was not chosen for some particular job, and who knows why, but it might have been because I was white or male or old or something, or Jewish, I don't know. But anti-Semitism, I'm very aware of it, of course. How could you not be in the world we're in now? But it's not something I've ever been consciously aware of being directed at myself.
It's a very interesting moment when you describe Churchill, then 85, giving one of his last public speeches.
Yes.
And you describe it as, in many ways, the tail end of an era.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
I was at Cambridge, at Jesus College. I had a nice open scholarship and was studying history, but I was also by then thinking increasingly internationally, globally. It's a period of NATO, World Health Organization, the development of possibly some kind of European coal and steel community that might develop further. I'd begun traveling a bit. I spoke good French. I'd been to Paris once or twice. And I wanted to know about the wider world. I always had this strange, rather, it wasn't aggressive, but it was an absolutely unstoppable curiosity. If I'm a little Jew, what's it like not being a Jew? What would it be like being a German? My dad during the war was shooting down German airplanes to save us from the Blitz. But those were young men whom he was killing. What would they have thought about what they were doing? I began to learn about America, and this is the centenary of the American Civil War period, or nearly late 50s. And what would it be like being a black in Mississippi or somewhere? And when I was at Cambridge, my first serious girlfriend was a beautiful blue-eyed blonde German girl. And I think she and I both knew that we were trying to make a better relationship between the backgrounds than that in which we had been raised. And when Churchill came, Churchill 85, as you say, David, came to Cambridge one day, and he gave a little speech. He went to what is now the site of Churchill College, which it was intended to be. And the old man bent over as best he could, tried to plant a tree, watered it a bit, gave a speech. And I, with the German girl, was watching him. He made a very moving speech. When I wrote the book, you've probably seen there's a photo of him actually there at that occasion by the tree that was planted. And Churchill College sent me that photo and the speech Churchill gave. And here's this great nationalist leader, Churchill, giving a very international speech about the future of the world, and we must all pull together. And when he was leaving, his car drove past near where we were, and those piercing eyes caught ours. He was just waving to the crowds, most of whom were rather older. And I was there with this girl, and he looked at us and waved, and we waved back. And I thought, here is Winston Churchill, leader of the free world who saved my life, probably. And here am I with a German girl, Jewish boy, and I somehow felt at that moment, and I remember feeling it then and there, and perhaps talking to her about it, this is a whole new future world that, if we are lucky, will be very much better than the one we've all grown up in. And of course, a lot of other things were changing at that very time. I was almost one of the last people to be at Jesus College when it was an all-male college, and always wearing the gown at dinner, all the rest of it. So things were changing radically in the late 50s. And of course, by the 60s, spectacularly so. This would have been the late 1950s.
And this was an encounter with history, with a great historical figure, and you were studying history. Where did that love of history, which has run through all your life, really, where did that come from, do you think?
Well, I think there are two things. One is I mean, it's both, you know, yourself and your environment. The environment was that I was brought up as a child doing what was obviously one of the most massive, destructive, barbarous, world history changing events in the history of humanity. Now, I remember when I heard that Hitler was dead, and I used to be given little boiled eggs for breakfast, and I really smashed that one open on that particular day. And I remember VE Day and all the rest of it. But I think I also, at Christ College Finchley, grammar school, ordinary grammar school, nice grammar school, good teachers, a lot of Jewish boys, some of whom who are alive I'm still friendly with. And we had a very young history teacher, about a dozen years older than me. He was sort of 25, 26, doing his first job or something. His name is Dennis Felsenstein, and he was a brilliant teacher, quite firm, quite clear, realized that I was quite good and quite pushy, but pushed me harder, never gave me a kind of A+. He was always kind of A- question mark, you know. You need to construct your essays more like this. If you're going to mention Gladstone and Disraeli, say roughly when they were prime minister, link everything up, explain at the beginning what you're going to consider, argue it with links, you know, moreover, on the other hand, sum up at the end. And he helped me so much, Dennis Felsenstein, to get an open scholarship to Cambridge. And I want you to know, and I want to say on the record, that I saw him most recently, about a month ago. We had coffee together. He's 94. And I've written a little bit about him in the book. I owe that man so much. And I think he, as much as the times in which I have lived, gave me this sense, not so much, not only of being a professional historian, which in some ways I have been at the Institute of Historical Research, at Senate House and Sussex long ago and so on, or Jesus College, Cambridge, but also part of me always wants to understand, how did something come about? If there's a debate about leaving the European Union or about what to do in Northern Ireland, I want to know, well, how did the problem come about in such a way that we might get those who disagree with each other to meet, look back over earlier history and discuss how to solve a problem, rather than, if we leave Europe, will I be richer or not? And so I suppose I've always had a historical awareness of things, which goes right back to school, the war, and dear 94-year-old Dennis.
What was Cambridge in the late 1950s? What was that like for a Jewish student?
Interesting question, David. I remember having been brought up very Jewish, very Orthodox, and then sort of post-bar mitzvah, post-pubic, beginning to ask awkward questions in the politest possible way. I wanted to break out into a wider world. I mean, the book is called Just Passing Through. You know, we're all just passing through. How long have any of us got? But it's also in the sense of I wanted to pass through barriers and doorways which had hitherto been closed to me. Why can't we have milk after meat? Oh, my dear Daniel, the Bible says, thou shalt not seethe the kid in its mother's milk, you know, and do we want to, yes, but how do you know that that bit of beef is from some cow whose mother's milk you've just been drinking or eaten cheese, you know? And more awkward questions. If we're not racist, are we? The Nazis were racist. We're not, are we? In which case, why should I, when I grow up, only go out with Jewish girls if we're all part of the same global race? And so I started asking awkward questions, carried on doing that. And then when I got the scholarship to Cambridge, my father took me up there for the week when I was to do all the scholarship exams. And my dear beloved dad quietly asked the chief porter at Jesus College, I'm the father of Daniel Snowman. He's taking the scholarship exam. Could you very kindly arrange that at dinner, I believe you called it hall, that he has some vegetarian meals? Would that be all right? Fine, which was fine, and I did. A year later, when I went up as an undergraduate, having won the scholarship, the chief porter remembered me. He said, oh, you're Mr. Snowman, aren't you? I said, oh, yes, how nice. He said, quietly, he said, would you like me to arrange that you have vegetarian meals? An arrogant little Dan said, oh, no, it's fine. I'll eat whatever's on offer, don't worry. And I realized that was kind of symbolic in a way of a change of attitude, which meant that I was trying out what it was like not being religiously Jewish, but obviously consciously, historically, culturally. If Israel's in the news, I notice it. I've been there many times. So Cambridge, I hoped, if I can answer your question, I hoped it would be the wider world that I was going to enter. And of course, when I got there, I found it was its own kind of enclosed world with its own behavioral patterns, and all the jolly good chaps all spoke without moving the upper lip like that, don't you know, and talked about motor cars and things like that, and you had to walk over the table to get to the other side of it in hall, but you were wearing your gown, of course, and it had its own language, behavior, the things you weren't allowed to do or you weren't allowed to say. So it was simply a different, honorable, enclosed world in which you adapted. And I remember feeling exactly the same when I then went off to Kennedy's America after that. I've always been looking for a wider, different, open world. And of course, every world I've ever been part of has its own enclosures. And that's the way life is.
I was going to ask, because then the next big step is that you go to America in the early 60s, talking of the wider world. And what an extraordinary time to be in America.
I was very lucky. I mean, as I look back and when I was bringing that book up to date, I've always been very aware that I was very, very lucky in the time and place of my little life, which I'm now, you know, well on the way to passing through. And I got a scholarship to the States. I went to one of the very interesting Cornell, upstate New York, where all the leading political scientists were friends of people who knew somebody in the White House. And in the White House was this handsome young intelligent, Anglophile, articulate historian, young fellow called John F. Kennedy. And we all revered him. And I not only worked very hard at the university and loved learning about America, and all my friends were American and so on. And I learned for the first time about the Federalist Papers and the Civil War, which was having its centenary around that time and so on. But I also, of course, like every visitor, wanted to travel. And over the course of, the next couple of years, so I went one way or another to or through something like 40 different states. Went to California for the first time, went down south. I spent a summer in West Texas, up in the Panhandle, top left-hand corner. I remember Texas is 5 times the size of Britain, so it's a huge area. And I spent a summer in Amarillo, Texas. And whenever there was something like the rodeo or something, they said, Dan, they called me Dan, 1 syllable, but it had about 5 vowels in it. Hi, Dan, why don't you go and write about the rodeo? You ever been to rodeo? Well, you're going to write it for tomorrow's paper. It's July 4th, and you can be on the front page, Dan. So interesting, scary, different, very right wing. Kennedy and the Supreme Court, they're all commie sympathizers. This is very much like today's Southern, very Protestant Trump South. And it was, as I say, the centenary of the Civil War, but in Mississippi and Alabama and Arkansas, they referred to it as the centennial of the War of Yankee Aggression. And I went down there and I spent one period staying with a Black family, working on civil rights with the Northern civil rights workers who were trying to get the Black community to dare register to vote. And some of them were murdered. And that too was a very powerful, moving, interesting experience and contributed to my sense of globalization and all people are created equal.
And you met Harry Truman during this period.
Yes. Since I was studying American government, American politics, my professor, Clinton Rossiter, was the expert on history of the presidency. And he encouraged me to undertake an MA on presidential decision-making. Obvious subject, there's Kennedy in the White House. I remember visiting the White House with a tourist group, be quiet, everybody, I'm going to show you the lovely rooms that Mrs. Kennedy has decorated, but be fairly quiet because the president's at the end of the corridor there having a little meeting, Anyway, I undertook this project on presidential decision-making, and I thought, I think I'm going to choose a case study, which would be, I don't know, something fairly recent. I know, the decision of President Truman to drop the atomic bomb, or the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Presidential decision making. I worked very hard at it. And I wrote to Truman, asking whether I could discuss it with him. I got a letter back from his secretary, if you're ever in this area, give us a call in a couple of days. In principle, the president would be happy to meet you. So when I was crossing back from having been in LA and everywhere in Hollywood and blah, 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 Seattle, we stopped over, I and a couple of other guys, we stopped over in Kansas City, more or less. I called the number I was given and it was agreed the president, ex-president, this was summer '63, would see me in his library in a couple of days' time. How about 10 in the morning? So I did. And this fat old geezer, he was younger than I am actually, but a nice big chubby tummy and a nice warm friendly smile and a handshake. Hi, what's your name? Oh, you're Dan Snowman? Surely not. How lovely to see you. What is it you're working on? And I explained to him, he's very amiable. I said, I'm working on a thesis on presidential decision making. And the subject I've chosen is your decision to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. You kidding? That was no decision. It was inevitable. All FDR's advisors were saying to me, and I'd only been president 2 or 3 months, this is the only way of ending the war, at minimal loss of life. Anything else involving invasion of all the Japanese islands was gone forever. And I was right. Now, So immediately he undercut my entire thesis with a grin and a giggle, and he enjoyed doing it. And of course, he made it quite clear that I could answer him back, and if he was rude to me, I could jovially be rude back. Oh, I said, I thought presidents spent the whole night tramping the corridors of the White House, head in hand, worrying about what they had to do tomorrow. Not at all. I never lost any sleep. Mind you, nor did your Winston. He was very similar, Dan. Now, you want to know what a real decision was? Now, the decision to go to war at Korea, that was a real decision. I had to make it because Dean Acheson said this and so on and so that. So great fun. The moment we left, and we were together, good 45 minutes or more, I was straight back to the hotel I was staying in. We didn't record in those days. I wrote the whole thing down as verbatim as I could remember. And it was very revealing and very interesting. And he kept saying, all you young intellectuals today, you think you can analyze decisions. You weren't there at the time. I'm afraid our president at the moment is a bit like that. But you're the same, Dan. You'll go far, So I wrote the whole thing up. And it meant a lot to me to have had that opportunity to meet somebody who was really at one time in power and to whom we owe a lot, the Truman Plan, the Marshall Plan, and so on.
And then you teach at Sussex for a few years, and then you start at the BBC, the beginning of a 30-year career at the BBC. It sounds from your fascinating description like a kind of golden age of the BBC. Is that fair?
Yes, it was an amazing time, David, having the opportunity at Cambridge, then in the States. And then there were these new universities opening up in Britain. There's a great sense of positivity, of government money, of culture and intellectual life and the Arts Council and the third program and all these things. It was a very positive period. And the new younger generation. I was a little older than the people who were trendy in the 60s, but not that much older. And yes, you're right. I was offered a job by post at the new University of Sussex by Asa Briggs, who later on went on and the great reviver of Victorian history, a lovely man, very kind. He wrote later on the whole history of broadcasting. When I moved to the BBC, I wrote his obit for the Times not so many years ago. So I went to Sussex. It was new, it was exciting, new job, new world. I was suddenly at the age of 24, 25, invited to invent new courses, to grade papers, to interview potential candidates and all the rest of it. But I was aware, my strength and my weakness, and I think it's the strength and the weakness of the book, David, is the kind of versatility, interested in a lot of subjects which people think of as separate. There's something called history, and there's something called music, and there's something called climate change, and there's something, all the rest of it. But what always interested me is seeing the links passing through the doors that were perhaps closed. And Sussex, yes, it was an attempt to be very interdisciplinary rather than simply studying history or physics or chemistry or languages. But there was a streak of me that wanted to go beyond that. I'd already found I was writing some popular articles for New Society or whatever, New Statesman, whatever it might be, Jewish Chronicle, as early as that, and doing broadcasts. And the BBC, suddenly they phoned me out of the blue. They'd heard about me. They needed somebody who knew about America because the 1968 elections were coming up and who knows what might go on there. And so I joined the BBC. Asa said, see how it goes, Daniel. I think that's good for you to do that. I had my first book coming out shortly after that about America. And he said, if it doesn't work, give me a ring, come back to Sussex. Just amazing, positive times. And there were, anybody who wanted a decent job with some kind of ability, jobs were growing on trees. I went to the BBC for a temporary period to try out. Went all over America and made a big documentary report about America in '68. Saw Bobby Kennedy campaigning 5 days before he was killed. Came back. BBC turned my contract into a permanent one. As you say, I was lucky enough to stay there for something about 30 years at what I think of as the heyday of the BBC. It was a magical period. Everything was positive, everything was optimistic. Let's try. If we don't try it, we won't know. There were regular meetings with the controllers, and we all sat around a table. And now, Daniel, I see on the agenda you've got something you want to propose. It's about something about the world economy, or going to the Antarctic, or interviewing American novelists. What is it? Tell us more. And I'd spout up and I'd say what I hope to be able to do. And somebody, Philip French or George Macbeth, the poet, or somebody around the table would say, I'm not sure what Daniel's proposing. Didn't Birmingham try and do that for us last year? Is so-and-so the right presenter of that program? Daniel, what do you think is be likely to cost? How long would it take you to make all those programs? You know, reasonable questions and criticisms in an environment of goodwill. And by and large, I was able, and I recount this in detail in the book, to do a huge number of creative programs. If I wanted to do a series about what do we mean by equality, equality of opportunity, equality of condition, and I wanted Isaiah Berlin to take part, I'd phone him. And we talk about it. He'd say, oh, Daniel, I like talking to you about opera, but you really want me to broadcast? You know, he'd recently done all these programs about romanticism. And people used to caricature the way he talked, you know, oh, very much like that, you know, looking up as a, oh, come on, you know you can do it. And he did, and he was lovely and he was wonderful. And I was in a position to offer that sort of opportunity without checking everything with the bosses. And when I look back now, I'm glad I left when I did. I feel it's going, I mean, whole nother subject, but it's gone through and is going through terrible crises these days for many, many reasons, partly political, partly ideological, partly because there's such a huge range of alternatives now, particularly in the digital age, whereas when I was there, the BBC meant something of high quality that millions would watch or listen to.
We could talk about the BBC and we could talk about your many books all night, but one particular book I'd really like to talk to you about is your book called The Hitler Emigrations, a very acclaimed book. And what led you to write this?
The Hitler Emigrations, yes. I suppose, well, again, like everything else, David, in some ways it goes back to childhood. I was brought up in Northwest London. I became, you know, aware of everything much more, but after the war, you know, I was born in 38. So it's really the late 40s, 50s. And whenever we went away on a holiday, a family holiday, my dad always had under his arm a book on the buildings of England by somebody called Nikolaus Pevsner, born in something called Leipzig or something. If we went to a concert, it was probably going to be, they'd take me to a concert at the Albert Hall, and it was probably conducted by Beecham or Bolt or Sargent, you know. It might have been conducted by Klemperer or Walter Goer or George Sell, or later on Schulte or something. And I gradually grew up realizing that anybody with a funny German name was probably going to be very, very clever. Why would that be? I was brought up in Edgware, but Northwest London generally. And then I gradually became aware of, I mean, my mother was terribly interested in developments in child psychology. She had an an exchange of letters with Anna Freud, and the whole Freud family, you know, dad was Sigmund and there's Lucian and all the rest of it. Everywhere I turn, and in the world of history, I learned to read over time, gradually over the years and decades to come, Geoffrey Elton on the Tudors. Geoffrey Elton is a foreign immigrant and he's writing about the Tudors. Eric Hobsbawm, biochemistry, Max Perutz. I mean, in every possible field, there were clever people. And so gradually I tried to put all this together and wondered what they had in common. Oh, the history of art by Gombrich. But someone told me that the publisher, Thames and Hudson, that couldn't be a foreign immigrant thing, but it was. And so much, much later on, when I'd written history, and had also lectured quite a lot and written quite a lot about the relationship between something called the arts, which everybody thought was one subject, and something called history, which is a totally different subject. No, they're not. They're similar subjects, related. Mozart was a bloke who ran into this kind of problem and tried to do that, and then got ill one day and then had this girlfriend, but lacked money because there was a war with the Turks. They're all art is, read Gombrich. It's not just about, I don't know, Leonardo or Michelangelo. It's about archaeology, it's about psychology, it's about where do you get the paint from, who knows who you are when there's no photography or newspapers yet. And so I put all this together with the encouragement of my agent, and we met various publishers. And I thought, yes, I'd love to try and write a book about the cultural impact of the refugees from Nazism, the Jewish refugees from Nazism. And here we are talking to an association of Jewish refugees. And of course, the more I thought about it, the more I was, they're not all Jewish. They're not all refugees. Most of them escaped from Nazism, and thank God that they did, and tried to put together all these different people, Weidenfeld, Klaus Moser, Gombrich, the Freud family, people in the sciences. Was there any kind of generalization you could make about what they contributed? Most of them weren't celebs. Most of them were just ordinary, boring people like the rest of us who were lucky to escape with their lives and get on with whatever they could. Some were villains and psychopaths and suicides. Some, whom we remember above all, were hugely talented and contributed enormously to the world that I've grown up in and that you've grown up in. I got to know the Amadeus Quartet very well, 3 of whom were refugees from Vienna. And I kind of tried to work out, was there anything particularly Jewish about what they contributed? Because the great majority were, according to Hitler, but not necessarily according to themselves, something that Gombrich talked about. And I thought a great deal about Isaac Deutscher, who talked about the non-Jewish Jew. The Jews like Marx or Freud or whoever, Mahler, who were always, as it were, traveling, not only in time and place, but in ideas. The bags are always packed, globally, And I thought, well, maybe there's something Jewish about not being isolatedly Jewish. Maybe there's something Jewish about people who went into high culture, education, the sciences. If you lived in Vienna, way back, I'm talking time of Mahler or something, you were not going to go into the Habsburg army or diplomacy or the church or anything like that. You couldn't. But you could go into art, entertainment, intellectual life, cultural life, just as Moses Mendelssohn had once done, or Moses Montefiore had done. The shul is not a place where you pray, it's a place where it's a school. The very idea of Jewishness seemed to me to be cultural in many ways, a kind of form of social mobility. And I concluded the book by saying, I think these people collectively, they were all very different. Judith Kerr was not the same as, but between them, they helped to professionalize our cultural life. Think of Schulte at Covent Garden. He was not going to put up with, jolly nice chaps who turned up on time and sang nicely. You had to do more than that. And the same was true at the Warburg Institute of Art Historians. And B, they cosmopolitanized our life, almost by definition. Weidenfeld wanted to publish books, perhaps by young post-war Germans or Austrians to help them, but make sure it got translated into Spanish, so that not only Spanish, but people right through Latin America might read their books. The bags are always packed. Eric Hobsbawm really introduced us the idea of cross-national history being a single intellectual entity. And all that I tried to encapsulate in the big book about the Hitler Emigrations. And of course, again, have a chapter about precisely that in the new memoir book that you've read.
And you describe them very interestingly as a bridge between the world of Central European modernism and the surprisingly insular world and conservative world of British culture. Can you say a little bit about
yes, I mean, I think, you know, all migrations bring culture with them. And we Brexiteers who want national independence and sovereignty sometimes forget that the Romans were here for 400 years, the Angles and the Saxons, the Normans, the very language I'm speaking to has all these people in it, the Huguenots, the Irish at the time of the famine, my great-grandparents, and the refugees from Nazism, of course, brought culture with them. And the culture they tended to bring, and I'm grossly oversimplifying, David, obviously, for the moment, but many of them were from the Viennese world of Klimt and Mahler and Freud and so on, or from Weimar era Berlin, perhaps, with the kind of satire that was going on. Very urban, a very urbane kind of culture. Look at the Bauhaus architecture, very modern, urbane in all the arts. Britain, of course, controller of a vast world empire, victor in the Great War of 1914-18, was nonetheless in its own artistic way. There was a great deal of Tudor-Beathan revival. Think of Lutyens' architecture. Think of Vaughan Williams writing variations on the theme of Thomas Tallis, or Greensleeves, or whatever it might be. The Garden Cities. It was very much a world looking inwards, greenwards. All the little jigsaw puzzles and little rhymes I was taught as a child all had to do with, you know, people in haystacks and little Bo Peep and all that. And it wasn't a very kind of urban, urbane, modern with a capital M culture. So that the culture of the refugees, the emigres, came too. The names I've just been mentioning, many of them, who came by and large in the late 30s, thank God they did, in the 37, 38. Some came a little earlier. A handful survived the camps and came after the war, but not many, you know. They came from this urban, urbane, Middle European culture with modern, everything was modern with a capital M, I am exaggerating, to this somewhat insular, you know, we've done it in the past and we can continue to do it the way we always used to, insular Britain. And 2 and 2, as so often, made 5. Between them, many of the refugees tried to adapt to rural, rus in urbe Britain, and learned to play cricket and be jolly good chaps and all the rest of it. I remember Carl Flesch's son telling me that. Oh, many of my BBC colleagues used to talk like that and joke about it. While the Brits gradually learned, just look at some of the post-war architecture all around St. Paul's Cathedral, wherever else, or St. Thomas's Hospital, to build a kind of, oh, the latest trendy thing is European modernism. Why don't we do that here? Of course, we're now going against it, but there was a kind of emerging, and the Festival of Britain in 1951 absolutely embodied that joint oldie Englandy with modern European all in one. And I remember going to it and loving both aspects of it.
Daniel, I could listen to you all evening. However, I'm going to have to pass you back to Deborah, who will, I'm sure, have some questions from audience. And if they run out of questions, I've got pages more questions here, so we'll come back to me. So in the meantime, thank you, Daniel. Happy birthday for tomorrow. And let me hand you over to Deborah.
Lovely. Thank you, David. Sorry if I talk too much.
No, not at all. I don't know if you can read the live transcription, can you, which somebody asked me to put on, which I didn't even know was a thing. But it struggled with some of the names that you were talking about, Daniel. It was quite amusing. Anyway, there's only one question, actually. So if anybody else has a question, please write it in the chat now. But this question is from Jacqueline, who asks, do you feel that history is academically undervalued in the present day for example, in relation to sciences?
Do I think that what's undervalued?
Do you feel that history is academically undervalued in the present day, for example, in relation to sciences?
I'm glad I'm not an academic now. And I feel, I don't want to get onto too controversial territory, but what I used to think of as history has changed radically in the course of my lifetime, in many ways for the better, and in some ways, and I'm inclined to agree with what lies behind that question, in recent times for the worse. When I was first learning history, it was very much top-down history. It was great men, it was battles, it was kings and queens and popes and archbishops and Wellington and Napoleon and all that. And the Holy Roman Empire, or whichever period you're talking about. And then gradually it reversed and became history from the bottom up. And we owe that to many of the historians whom I knew, like Raphael Samuel and others, who began to think about, well, it's one thing to learn all about Nelson and the Battle of Trafalgar, but what was it like being a young man who was press ganged into the Navy at that time and very likely to die during the course of the fights? Well, you can't know that because they didn't write diaries or autobiographies. Then gradually, it became obvious that there was evidence from the lower classes, the ordinary people, the untutored. There were the texts of law cases when somebody was accused of libel. There were little love letters. There were things written on tombstones. There were many, there were popular songs, folk songs. There's a great deal of evidence of ordinary people. And then it became more increasingly obvious that this was mostly male. What about all the women? Well, they wrote even less. You knew even less about them. It's one thing to try and write about the history of health, welfare, sexuality, birth, death. But what was it like living an ordinary life as a woman? I must say, as an old man, I am appalled when I read back to the way in most of history men have treated women. And in fact, in most of the world today, just appalling. So, of course, in our own times, rightly, there's been a growth of egalitarianism in history between the sexes or the genders, between the races, a reassessment of British imperial history, French imperial history, and so all of which I applaud and write about this in the course of the book. I sometimes feel that the putting the past right, because it's always been biased, has occasionally run the risk of taking the bias to the other extreme. If, I'm interested in opera and opera history and musical history. I sang for many, many years, nearly half a century, with the London Philharmonic Choir. I wept when I read that dear Bernard Haitink, the conductor, had died the other day, whom I sang under many times, and Sholti and all the rest of them. But if I read about, and I've written about opera history, most of the celebrity figures I'm writing about inevitably are male. Mozart, Verdi, Puccini, Wagner, and so on. And if somebody says, well, people go on and on about Felix Mendelssohn, what about his sister Fanny? She wrote songs too. Yes, but the reality of history is that it was impossible. Women could write novels, women could paint, they could do things that were a one-person creativity. But there was no way throughout most of history of the West and the rest of the world that they could take on large-scale projects that would, like writing a symphony or an opera, that would require a lot of money, a lot of rehearsal time, a lot of personnel, putting it on at a great hall, when their entire lives were secluded by the need to have a relationship, to earn money, and to reproduce. Think that women, until really not very long ago historically, could not own property or have the vote. Of course, they had to find a wealthy partner, husband, who'd pay for them. And unless you did something individual, Clara Schumann was a good pianist, for example. There's no way until fairly modern times you could, and I think history is perhaps running into difficulties by overcompensating for some of the problems of the past. And the final point I want to make, it's a good question, is that if I were a youngster now, male or female or anything in between, and was concerned with finances, having to work from home, will I ever get a job and work in an office somewhere and earn a decent full-time salary for life with a pension at the end of it? These are very, very difficult times. I would want to gravitate towards some kind of study, and it might well be the sciences or engineering or something, that would lead me to the possibility of real paid employment. Whereas the humanities, the arts, history, being an expert on French or German literature, much, much harder. And therefore, I think that the study of history today and the teaching of history and the writing of history are all going through a very difficult phase. At the Institute of Historical Research in Senate House, where I have a senior research fellowship, they have a centenary right now, 21 to 22. And they're struggling to try with events that probably all have to be online for an audience that used to be a huge, wide audience of people, either academically expert in history or interested in going on history tours, reading history books, reading the latest Hilary Mantel, or whatever it might be. And a lot of that is at the moment diminishing, very, very sadly. We need to know about the past and how things came to be as they are in the present. And the diminution of history and the problems with it, which your question asked, I get seriously worried about.
Deborah, if you're out of questions, can I leap back in, or do you have some more?
Please do.
You're very kind. Daniel, me again. Back to the Hitler Emigrations. What do you think was their biggest influence of all, collectively or individually?
Very hard to generalize. I tried suggesting that they obviously, like all immigrant groups, helped to cosmopolitanize our culture. If we have this interview again, David, which I hope we will in about 50 years' time, and we look back at the migration patterns of today, which are going to get bigger and more potentially difficult politically, because the world is growing in population and there's desperation around the world, those who do migrate to wherever will have an influence. I suspect our culture in 50 years' time will be increasingly influenced by African, Islamic, Chinese cultural influences of various kinds. May not just be the string quartets they write or something, or the operas. It may well be our diet, our clothing, the kind of language we use, the kind of language we have to avoid using, the way we embrace each other or don't. All these things are part of the wider culture influenced by waves of migrants. That particular wave, well, there are many particular things that individuals created. I mentioned Judith Kerr, I mentioned Schulte or the Amadeus Quartet, or Lucian Freud, or Karl Popper, the philosopher, and so on. It certainly helped Britain to become more cosmopolitan, more internationally minded at that stage, which they've been retreating from in more recent times, and to think more European and perhaps less imperial and wider world, so that people began to know something more about not only Schubert and Mozart and Beethoven and so on, but perhaps about Goethe or Günter Grass or whatever it might, other aspects of Central European culture, not just Mahler, but Bruckner, other and so on. And I think it was the cosmopolitanism and the cross-cultural, the very idea when I was at Sussex that there were cross-disciplinary studies. I would teach something about modern American urban development or suburban development to a class that had a literary figure at the other end of the table, and me with my political science American background, and we would look for links between the subjects rather than that's political science, that's history, that's literature. And Sussex had a school of European studies and also a school, they didn't have departments, of international development. I learned that the word development meant helping financially the poorer parts of the world, not just out of goodwill and kindness, but they would therefore reproduce less, they would therefore have more food, they would therefore, all kinds of development that we could perhaps contribute to.
And finally, sorry, if I may, if I may, one question. Of course, many were welcomed and their achievements were recognised. Some were not. What do you think that depended on? That some were welcomed as insiders, some were left out as and rejected as outsiders,
and some were pretty criminal. Some ran newspapers and fell off a boat at one point. No names, and I certainly won't mention his daughter. And they were very different. Some went into education, Gordonston. There was certain I think it's partly, as in your life and my life, it's partly luck, it's partly judgment, partly whom you happen to meet who offers you a job to do something. So many of the things that I've mentioned weren't predestined, but I met somebody full of goodwill, or somebody heard me lecture or read something I wrote and said, oh, by the way, what are you doing next year? We need somebody who knows about that. Any chance you could get a year off the BBC and come and work at this college in California for a year, because we need someone like you. And I did. I spent the academic year 72-3 in Southern California, Los Angeles, teaching American studies, and the BBC kept my job open for me because they knew that I'd be back and I'd probably bring back all sorts of American contacts that would be useful, etc. Luck as well as judgment, I think. But, and as I say, I was born and raised and lived, if I can put myself in the past tense, at a lucky time and place. I've never really been in great pain. I've never suffered from serious anti-Semitism. I've never been starving. I still get a little pension from the BBC, so long may the BBC last. Am I allowed to cross my fingers at an AJR event? And let's live on and hope. By the way, I'd like to say, because we're reaching the end, there won't be, there are lots of people in the audience here that I know and I'm very fond of, and nice to see, and many that I don't, but would love to know better. If you do have questions or further comments or criticisms, look me up. I've got a website, I've got a funny name. You can easily find my email or phone me. I'd love to hear from some of you and to know whether there are other things that maybe David and I could have talked about on an occasion like this. Do get the book if you can. And anything in that you think should be changed for the next edition, be the first to tell me. And there are great advantages in having a silly name. Schneemann, or whatever the hell it once was. Schnurlowski, I think they're all Polish.
And on that cheery note, let me hand you back to Deborah.
Yes, lovely. So how was that name? I mean, I don't know what the live transcription made of that pronunciation. No, that was wonderful, Daniel and David. Thank you, David, for chairing as majestically as always. And Daniel, fascinating life. Can't wait to read your book. Sounds absolutely unputdownable, I think is the word they use. So I look forward to reading it. And thank you so much for giving up your time this evening on your Erev birthday. So I'm sure we wish you all a happy birthday for tomorrow. And thank you again for joining us.
Lovely, Deborah. Thank you for having me, inviting me. Been lovely. Good luck with the AJR.
Thank you. Lovely. Well, good night, everybody. Good evening.